everyone, if someone is not speaking, just to unmute yourself.
Mute.
Yes, in order, like, not to have too much noise. And I'm now going to already join the live connection to Facebook.
Okay, now we go. We're ready to go.
Whomever wants, second, Dr. Ismail, and whomever wants can share it from its Facebook to...
Okay. I will, just to sum up where we were, I'll make an introductory statement, and then I will call on members of the panel and ask you each to speak about 3 minutes or so. So then we get everybody. Having had that first round, we will go into discussions with the panel, and then hopefully Secretariat will give us questions from the floor. Okay?
Yes.
So let's start. Right now will be just right. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege to meet with you here today to celebrate the Russell-Einstein Manifesto 65 years ago. The Russell-Einstein Manifesto was a landmark decision of 10 of the greatest intellectuals in the world at the time to present their views about the risks that were engaged in the use of nuclear weapons and how that could lead to global destruction. They had just witnessed the start of an arms race and had seen 10 years before the disastrous impact on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank God that in general, after all these years and decades, these remain the only examples of actual utilization of nuclear weapons on human civilians. Nevertheless, the risks were very severe and the arms race continued. And it was out of that manifesto that really called for our common humanity, and whose key phrase has been repeated many times, including by none other than Joseph Rotblat in receiving the Nobel Prize for the Pugwash conferences. He said again, remember your humanity and forget the rest. That has to be still our guiding principle to this day. What is particularly stunning is to see how much that original manifesto brought about. Einstein signed the manifesto just before his death, a few months before Russell presented it to the public in May of 1955. And since that time, they have had a major impact on the thinking of the world. First, there was the creation of the General Conference, which was in the manifesto, and that Cyrus Eaton provided support for, and it became known as the Pugwash conferences, and the first of which was held in 1957 in London, and which subsequently had such an impact that the institution received the Nobel Prize. And Joseph Rotblat, who I may say, very important point that most people don't know, that Joseph Rotblat was the only scientist who left the Manhattan Project because of moral issues. He just disagreed with working on a bomb of such destructive power. So they won the Nobel Prize in 1995 for a record of having changed the attitudes of the world about nuclear weapons and about peace and the importance of peace through that emphasis on our common humanity. In fact, the risks that they saw were very real. This was an unbridled arms race that has started in the world, and that unbridled arms race brought us to a very appropriate acronym called MAD. It was called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. And I had the pleasure of discussing at length with my old friend, God rest his soul, was Robert McNamara. And he would say, for 7 years, I was a member of making these decisions. And each one of the decisions that we made seemed to be reasonable at the time. But collectively, they were totally mad. And he gave an image that stays with me to this day. He said, we were like two people sitting up to our waists in gasoline. And one saying, I have 13,000 matches, and the other one saying, I'm going to have 14,000 matches. It is a totally mad scenario. We have to take away the gasoline, throw away the matches, take away the gasoline, start thinking differently. And he said, and I, Robert McNamara, for 7 years, as Secretary of Defense of the United States, was part of that madness. So I recognize how you can be looking at a narrow perspective and not looking at the big perspective. So the Russell-Einstein Manifesto begat the Pugwash conferences that had a major impact on world attitude, but they also begat our beloved World Academy of Arts and Sciences. And we are very happy that the Academy is continuing with its emphasis on leadership in thought that leads to action. And also is trying to look at how a global university would be. So all of these are some of the impacts of that great manifesto. But there's more. If you think about it, we've had the SALT I Treaty in 1972, the SALT II Treaty in 1979, and then the INF Treaty in 1987, and then the START I in 1991, START II in 1993, and the SORT Treaty in 2002, and the New START in 2010. All of these are attempts to curtail the emphasis on and the amount of accumulation of nuclear weapons. Regretfully, the United States is pulling out of these treaties today and is challenging a lot of the accumulated wisdom that has been found. But perhaps the most important of all the treaties, and I will turn in a moment to Maria Espinosa, the Madam Chair of the General Assembly, was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The NPT has been signed by 191 countries. It's the biggest treaty of its kind, the Non-Proliferation Treaty of Nuclear Weapons. And it had really three pillars: to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, to further the goals of nuclear disarmament in general and complete disarmament if possible, and to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of the new technologies, in this case, of course, the nuclear technologies. But that treaty has always had imbalances. We have had additional people who have acquired nuclear weapons since that time, and we have had some governments that do not declare their policies about whether or not they do stock up nuclear weapons or not. But we have been reminded, above all, that to remember our common humanity. And I think that then we have looked back, if we look back at the history from the Russell-Einstein Manifesto to the present, there was a period in the 90s and the beginning of this century when humanity came together and recognized the importance of our common humanity. And that was through a series of summit meetings, from the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, onwards to Beijing in 95, to Rome in 96 on food security, et cetera, creating a consensus that development as a whole is more important for all of humanity, not just for the rich. And that led us to the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000, from 2000 to 2015, and now the Sustainable Development Goals. And a recognition, well, by almost all the governments of the world, a recognition of the overarching issues that we are facing with climate change and with global poverty and the need for food security and other important issues that we have to address in order to bring about an end to poverty, which again McNamara had defined beautifully by saying absolute poverty, it's not a matter of $1.9 or $1.6. It is a condition beneath any definition of human decency. And I think our desire to abolish that says much about our willingness to move. Now, would the founders of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto be satisfied with our movement? I think not. I think they would want us to move further and faster than we have done, but at least we are going in the right direction. And so, having said that, I would like to turn first to Maria Espinosa and ask Madam, I know the General Assembly has taken several, in fact, these three major resolutions concerning the NPT and other treaties. Do you see the General Assembly playing a big role in the next steps where we utilize the anniversary of the 65th anniversary of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto to give new impetus to thinking about our common humanity? The floor is yours, Madam.
Well, thank you very much to the World Academy of Sciences for bringing us together. Thank you, Ismail. I cannot agree more with your assessment. If you allow me, I would like to start by making a tribute to Ruth Adams. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a pioneer since she was the only woman present in the July 1957 at the first Pungwash Conference in Nova Scotia. And allow me also to quote her. And she said, to those of us in Chicago, the manifesto was like finding a crack in the Iron Curtain, especially to me and to many of those in my generation in that setting. It gave meaning and set a principle direction that we could follow with enthusiasm. And I think she was so right. And now here we are, 65 years later, we are asking ourselves the question if the Russell-Einstein Manifesto is still relevant today. And my answer to this question is, of course, an emphatic yes, of course, because all the reasons that you have outlined, Ismail. So today, as at the end of the Second World War, we are also experiencing turbulent times with great uncertainty, with great fear. I think that this pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has forced us to look ourselves in a mirror, to recognize that we live in an interdependent, interconnected world. It made us realize how frail we are as a species. So it is extremely relevant that we take a time to slow down. And here, before I discuss the role of the General Assembly and of the United Nations, I think that this is a time of reflection, a time for creativity and opportunity. I strongly believe that. We know that we cannot go back to normal because normal was the problem in the first place. And you said it so clearly, you know, we have all this incredible international architecture, but there are some obstacles, structural limits to make us deliver on what we have already agreed, including, of course, the NPT. And the other issue is that I said the normal was the problem in the first place because inequality and poverty and conflict and the nuclear threat are not normal. No? So I think that in 1955, going back to the appeal of Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, I think that sparked a movement of scientists and scholars to devote their intellect to fostering international dialogue for peace and the elimination of nuclear weapons in particular. But we are in a similar moment, you know, to spark a movement of building back better or of rethinking our current world. So I think that the phrase you mentioned, Ismail, remember your humanity, remains so relevant. So just 10 years after the UN Charter was signed in San Francisco, this human appeal reaffirmed the importance of multilateralism to sustaining peace. Multilateralism in the sense of greater cooperation, greater solidarity, greater collective agency. I think that the manifesto precisely reaffirmed the key aspects of the UN Charter, including Article 1, you know, on the prohibition of the threat or use of force in international relations. And it's Article 36 on processes and mechanisms for the peaceful resolution of conflicts. It's all there, it's written in the Charter. And we have agreed and signed that Charter. 75 years ago. So the message was clear on the manifesto, and also, we subscribe that charter, a call to humankind, to every human creature, to be agents of peace against the nuclear threat, which could and can even today, wipe us all out. It is not a joke, and you're the experts on that, and perhaps we will hear more. And I think that we understood that message. I think that the Pungwash movement in 1957 and the founding of the World Academy of Art and Sciences in 1960 were amongst these global responses to the manifesto in a way. So today, while humanity is living one of the most, the worst, I would call sanitary emergencies, but with multidimensional effects, I think that we are also suffering the deepest economic crisis since the Great Depression. So this appeal of the manifesto, remember your humanity, remains so pertinent, so much needed. And if you allow me, perhaps in a second round during the questions, I would like to highlight the irreplaceable role in peace that women play with very concrete examples. But just to close my initial intervention, I would like to highlight three ideas. First of all, I think that the manifesto has enormous significance for today's world. We seriously need to address the implementation deficit, and you mentioned that. If we could only deliver on the UN disarmament agenda that we have in front of us, if we could unlock the sometimes hopeless conference on disarmament of the UN, if we could deliver on the NPT, if we could make the historical nuclear weapons ban treaty a reality. We need more signatures, as you know. We need 90 signatures. We have a little above 30. So we will be much better off. So the billions wasted in the arms race in general, and nuclear weapons in particular, could very well serve our efforts to fight poverty, inequality, and building back better. The number two takeaway would be that women have to be front and center of any initiative, idea, recovery strategy. Investing in women well-being, in our economic and political empowerment, including our voice and agency in disarmament affairs and conflict resolution, really pays off. And as at the end of the Second World War, we need to reaffirm our commitments to the UN Charter. Multilateralism is not an option. It is the unique way to address a peaceful common future to all. So to build back better post-COVID-19 or during COVID, global governance is much needed. Global leadership and a more inclusive, sustainable international response that need to be addressed. And the front and center of this peaceful world that we need to reimagine and rebuild has to be, of course, disarmament. And we have a commitment, and we need to overcome this implementation deficit. And I will close by that, and then happy to respond to any further questions.
Yeah, I noted that you want to come back to the issue of gender and peace, and I suppose the Security Council Resolution 1325 must play a role in that as well. Let me now turn, if I could, to David. David, you are the chair of Canadian Pugwash, and we just mentioned at the outset that Pugwash was really born out of this manifesto, and went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize 40 years later for a distinguished record of achievement. And I think it would be wonderful if we could have a few words from you at this beginning of these discussions. David, you have the floor. Please unmute. David, can you please unmute? Yes.
There we are. Thank you all. Thank you everyone for inviting me. It's great to see you all. I really have looked forward to this event. My background is, from the start, was in foresight. And the reason I joined Pugwash was because, for me, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto was one of the most important statements in foresight that's ever existed. And it has continued to grow in importance as the world has become more complicated. I get to Pugwash, Nova Scotia quite often. One of the sort of sad things about going there is it's such a beautiful place, and then we have to sit down in that beautiful setting and discuss some really terrible things that go on. Having been a peacekeeper 3 times in rather violent wars, remember your humanity is something that keeps racing around in my brain. Maybe if I could have 7 points very briefly. Everyone should read the latest Economist with their annual session on the world if. Everyone should read an earlier Economist with a section called The World Disorder, the New World Disorder, because it will help us situate the renewed relevance of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto with that perspective. I have 3 guiding axioms. One is by Mr. Einstein. He said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I've been guilty of that many times myself. But in light of the change that has happened, I think that is something to reflect on. Secondly, Ralph Nader, the famous American, involved in auto safety. The function of leadership is to produce more leaders, not more followers. And I raise that because I'm a little worried that we, in our generation, our experience, our wisdom, we are not yet being joined by enough of the young people who are going to be the leaders. Men, women, disabled, all races, cultures, colors in the future. And I worry about that because the next normal after the pandemic era, that is already being sort of developed. What challenges me to think about is the normal after next. And that's when the youth of today will be the leaders of the world. And what we leave them, our legacy, is important. And the Vernon Saunders law, he was a baseball player. Some baseball players have made pretty interesting comments. His comment is, experience is a And now, in our world, we have, in my view, 4 inconvenient truths. One is that we're in a race against changing context. And the second is context is being compressed because with change happening faster and faster, more and more history being written every day, some true, some not. The fact that experts in the past, and I have a slide I'm more than willing to share with you. I don't have a share screen.
Can I interrupt for a second? This is this whole conference is lasting 1 hour, correct?
Yeah.
In that case, I don't understand the timing. This is now 10:20. We cannot continue to repeat
3 minutes.
these invocations. You know, I thought we were going to look forward to what can be done. These are invocations.
Okay,
So
I will finish.
this
Yeah,
is
it's not an invocation. I will finish with a statement that Marie Fernando Espinosa said. She said, if only. Well, let's turn this around and say, what if? And then inspect each of those issues that she raised. Mr. Chairman, I will finish there in light of Mr. Lutvak's comments.
Yeah, no, I mean, Mr. Lutvak is a very distinguished person, and I'm sure we all want to hear what he has to say. So, Mr. Lutvak, you have now the floor.
You're very kind. I was involved in a SALT process. it happened because the United States had deployed enough ballistic missiles to destroy all the maximum possible destruction, more than half the industry and 3/4 of the population. The Soviet Union had also reached that point. All the pug washing that went on, all the talk, all the chit chat was irrelevant. The Americans stopped because they could not, adding weapons would not be able to increase destruction because they reached the culminating point of destruction. The Soviet Union was the same. Please go back to 1945. You have the sudden meeting of two very provincial political entities, Americans and Russians. They meet. If there was no nuclear weapons, I guarantee the World War III would have started within 3 years in Berlin, fulfilling Hitler's dream. We would have had a very extensive war and many people happy. Please also go back to the Truman decision. Mr. Truman decided to drop the bomb before it was known that atomic weapons have radiation effects. It was not known. None of the decision makers knew that. So from their point of view, it was a bigger bomb. Before dropping the bomb, the Americans had invaded Japan. They made the island of Iwo Jima, the smallest island of the Japanese archipelago, which has thousands of islands, the smallest inhabited, really. And they lost 10,000 soldiers in 24 hours. They therefore discovered that fighting Japanese is not a picnic like fighting Germans or fighting Russians. When you fight Japanese, it's like trying to find a defect in a Toyota. You can't, okay? And the Americans calculated that they would lose 2 million people and kill about 30 million Japanese. That was the Truman decision. The way, this is very important for the next thing now, which is the international architecture. The most important architecture was done by the atom spies, because some of them clearly understood that in order to avoid a world war, the Russians also needed a nuclear weapon. They were not bought, nobody gave them any money, they had the strategic concept, and they were right. Now, move on to the international, Maria Fernandez Espinosa, y lamentablemente, etc., we can't speak in our native language. The fact is that the international architecture had the following impact on the Khmer Rouge massacre of its own population: 0. The international architecture did not stop Rwanda. In Rwanda, the killings, the Hutu killing of the Tutsis was not stopped, even though one European battalion, just one battalion, could have stopped the killing of 1 million people. And then in Syria, we have this prolonged exercise. Where are the Arab countries when Arabs are being killed? Where are the Sunnis when Sunnis are being killed? Where are, let's call them the Mediterraneans, when people in Syria are bombed with so-called barrel bombs? It is an old oil barrel with high explosive and some chemicals added for the taste and so on. Where is the international? This international architecture occupies a lot of civil servants who go around, functionaries, conferences, meetings. The actual impact is 0. 0 when it comes to resolving any issue involving killing. Now, of course, there are so many UN agencies, they do all kinds of things, many of them are really useful. But the function for which UN was invented was to prevent Syria, prevent all this stuff. And also, you will notice, if you like, the Iran-Iraq war, 1 million people were killed, chemical weapons were extensively used, chemical weapons and so on, and nobody did anything about it. When the Americans eventually destroyed Saddam Hussein, it wasn't because of the genocide, the massacre, it was because they believed that by removing a dictatorship, the Iraqis would become democratic. They had never been to Iraq. They had no idea that Sunni, Shia, Kurd, 3 kinds of Kurds, and Turkmens were just waiting to kill each other, and that Uncle Saddam was the one who was preventing the killing of people. So what we have here is illusions. That is, the whole Pugwash thing existed. People did meet, they talked. There were resolutions, they talked. But the reason why they stopped adding ballistic missiles was because they had passed the culminating point of effectiveness. And they could get nothing by adding. And
Okay, so you think that there is no value to further discussions among ourselves? That
I think that humans, errare, humanum est, humans make errors. And it was understandable that people who did not realize the metric. I was working on weapons development. I was working on force development. Then I was brought to the Congress to advise the chairman on the SALT treaty and so on. So I looked at it. But it is our duty to look at the realities, international reality. And it's understandable that the people who went to PUC they were not idiots. Many of English people, it's just they thought that they were useful. They didn't realize that the actual machine that was driving it was the issue of military utility. And now at the issue of military utility, look at the practicalities if we want to do something about real problems. And there are, of course, problems, including the Syrian civil war. Where are all these people who talk about humanity when you have the massacre of the innocents going on not overnight, not in some remote place like Rwanda, not deep in Cambodia, which was then considered remote, but right there, right in front of you. And nobody's doing anything about it. We must ask that question, which is there actually an alternative approach? Because
But is there, do you see any alternative approach that you would like to propose to the UN-based multilateralism?
Well, the UN-based multilateralism is so structured. It's so structured that it cannot accept that arrangement. But if may I remind you that after the Napoleonic Wars wiped out and destroyed social structures all over Europe for the great benefit of the peasantry and to the suffering of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy got together and they had an actual Council of Europe where they successfully avoided war in Europe for a very long time. They interrupted warfare all the way up to 1870. And even that, and what we have here is that people who have a real stake in preventing this, for example, stopping the Syrian war, the people who have an actual stake in it outside the UN framework, because in the UN framework, the first thing that happens is that if anything substantive is done, all it does is that it generates a veto. That's the only effect of operating for the UN. I mean, it's not by accident that the UN failed to intervene in any of the post-1945 genocides. One of the stupidest slogans I've heard is never again. It's not, it is false. It's just a total delusion.
Okay. I thank you for your intervention, Mr. Lodberg. I beg to disagree with you on that. I think multilateralism is the only way for the future. And I'll give you an example. In the creation of the European Union has succeeded in going from an economic agreement into an agreement that has prevented war among the member states for almost 70 years. Now, let me turn, I think, to someone who has lived a recent war, and I'll ask my friend Zlatko Gumzija if you would like to comment about what can and cannot be done in terms of avoiding war. And so let's hear from Zlatko, and then I will turn to Nathalie Goulet later. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ismail. I mean, it was a great idea. I mean, to organize this event, and I thank you and Gary and all others, and Roshan especially, who made this exchange of views possible. Of course, Einstein, the legend says in my part of the world that when Einstein invented theory of relativity, he was thinking about academics who, when they speak for 5 minutes, they think that, when they speak for 5 minutes, they have no clue that they spoke for 25 minutes. So as a matter of fact, when they hear people speaking, when they speak for 25 minutes, they have a feeling that they speak only 5 minutes. So, I mean, it's very relative. Everyone is having an idea that he's the one who is speaking very short and everyone is very extensive. On the end, I mean, probably today's event will in our hour and a half, we'll stay probably about 6 or 7 hours, having in mind how we relatively hear each other. I heard very interesting ideas by previous speakers, and I'm really looking forward to hear another ones. But 3 days ago, all world was, it was all over the news. It was CNN-able again, 25 years of Srebrenica, the last genocide in 20th century in Europe. We had all major players, current leaders of the world, who were giving live video messages to the commemoration center in Srebrenica. And of course, everyone was saying that the world has to learn the lessons, from what happened in Srebrenica. Obviously, what happened there is, today everyone admits, even the people from that time, the key players at that time, Secretary General, that are still alive, from Kofi Annan to Ban Ki-moon and even today Guterres, they all say that international community failed terribly in Srebrenica and that will never happen again. Unfortunately, it's happening again. I mean, there is no multilateralism doesn't look serious because they're not serious about taking seriously their own decisions. That's what we have. And of course, when I'm saying that, I want to underline that the UN is definitely not perfect organization, but there is no replacement for UN under these stages, the circumstances. So we have to do everything in our power to create a sense of urgency that something has to be done with multilateralism to be rejuvenated again. But if we want to be taken seriously, we have to be sure and to see that when decision is made, then it will be implemented. It is for real. Today we have Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, we have a situation in which obviously, who cares about Security Council decisions that were very clear, but we were saying that Hojala is Srebrenica of that part of the world. Everyone's saying it will never happen again. What I'm trying to say is that first thing we have to do is rejuvenate multilateral organizations, but the most important thing is that they have to be taken seriously by the people who are. And I don't think that they will be taken seriously. We make a pressure from all over the world, from different parts of the different stakeholders. We have to make a pressure because politicians are making decisions based on their promises, but most of the time they make decisions based on the pressure that they have from the real world. And that's the reason why I think that this time, having in mind 65th anniversary of Russell-Einstein Manifesto, we should think about how we should make a pressure on decision makers in the world. At that time, there was one threat, atomic bomb. Today, we have at least 4 threats in front of us. We have atomic bomb, we have disruptive technologies from artificial intelligence and things like that that can be even more destructive than atomic bomb. We have COVID right now, and we have above all climate change. So those 4 things, every one of them is as dangerous as atomic and nuclear weapons. Now, why decision makers would make decisions? If they are pressed and if they understand that these 4 things are the things that are driving us in direction in which there is no way that anyone is winner. So we have expression for the war, you don't need 2, you need 1. For peace, you need 2. But if one thinks that he can go through, then he will provoke the conflict and get on. So we have to, based on those 4 things, disruptive technologies, atomic energy, climate change, and COVID-like biological potential weapons, we have to clear the awareness that there is no way that anyone is going to win. And I think, Ismail, one of my best examples of where we are is this famous doomsday clock that was made back in 47. Back in 53, it started 7 minutes to midnight in 47. In 53, when Russians followed up Americans with hydrogen bomb and with Korean War in its peak, it came to 2 minutes to midnight. 2 years ago, after Trump withdrew from climate change, and after climate change was not, let's say, managed at all, then it came back to 2 minutes to midnight. This year, before COVID, it is 100 seconds to midnight. So it's minute and 40 seconds to midnight at this very moment, not thinking about COVID, not having in mind COVID at all. So I think that we have to create, as in some of our previous events, as you know, Ismail, there is a word that we coined that I heard very many times. We have to create alliance of like-minded people, like-minded entities, to make a pressure that the world is going in no-way street, a dead-end street. And if 65 years ago we had one threat, today we have at least 4 threats of that type. So if we don't do something, decision makers will be not in capacity to make decisions, because there will be no one to make decisions for, because they will not be there to make decisions anyway as well. So to make a long story short, I think we didn't learn a lot from our history.
Thank you. Thank you, Zlatko. There's something I need to share with you, because I happen to have been in the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations when it happened. Boutros Ghali had made a proposal that the Security Council, the permanent members of the Security Council, should have on standby parts of their armies that could be called forth to implement decisions of the United Nations. And as he pointed out, I, as Secretary General, do not make these decisions. It is you in the Security Council who do so. You are the 5 who have the veto power in the Security Council. When you make a decision, you then ask the Secretary General to implement it. Now, I happened to be with him in his office when he wanted to move 180 Pakistani volunteers from Pakistan to Somalia. And the Pakistanis were saying, we've put our soldiers, but we can't move them there. So he called the Secretary of Defense of the United States, who said, I have nothing in my budget to move Pakistani soldiers. So he called the Secretary, the President of the United States, who said, okay, I will talk to the Secretary of Defense. And then he called the Secretary of Defense again. He said, did the President give you? He said, yes. But we will do it provided that the cost of moving these 180 soldiers from Pakistan to Mogadishu will be counted as our contribution, part of our contribution for the peace and security. Now, Boutros Ghali said to me, just to move 180 soldiers, I have spent 4 hours of phone calls with the most important people in the world, the President of the United States, Secretary of Defense. Why can't we have a decision that the 5 members have ready-made groups of people in their armies? They will not be moved except by their collective agreement that they want to deploy troops there, rather than every time asking the UN then to assemble forces to negotiate with all the countries in the world to try to get something going. Now that is an inside picture that I happen to have been present for and saw with my own eyes. And I therefore realized that indeed some of the problems that we tell the UN are of the making of the big powers, and that we need to come back again to convince people that something needs to be done. So with that, may I then turn to Senator Nathalie Goulet, please. Would you unmute yourself? Thank you.
It's done. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me with your knowledgeable panel. You know, I've been a lawmaker for the last 13 years. And by the way, I don't feel very optimistic about international community. What we were talking about Nagorno-Karabakh some minutes ago, and we just had from 4 or 5 soldiers dead today or yesterday killed by Armenian army. We have a lot of trouble everywhere. We have a green area and a lot of country without governance. More and more we have terrorism. And I think that especially under the Trump administration, I think international community is just a dream. I mean, it's just 2 words, doesn't mean anything. You don't have, Europe is very weak. Security Council is very weak. And so I'm not very optimistic about the situation. I think that what can be done, and I don't, the gentleman who spoke just before me, is moving the civil society. I mean, that is the point, because, you know, the political parole, I mean, the politician, nobody believes them anymore. And I don't know if you have that in your different country, but it's very, very difficult. You are surrounded by fake news. You are surrounded by the social network. You are surrounded by complotism. And then it's very, very difficult to settle a strategy and have some result. So I have absolutely no idea what we can do to make the world better. And, you know, it looks like a Rubik's Cube. You know the Rubik's Cube? Somebody touch it and nobody can fix it anymore. Everything is up and down and we cannot fix it. And the international community right now make me think to this mad Rubik's Cube. So we can buy and sell between people of goodwill. I trust you, you trust me, the center is nice, we are all nice people with a nice brain and knowledgeable with a nice education, wishing the best for humanity. But at the end of the day, the people are starving in the street. I was in Yemen 2 years ago. And the people are starving in Libya, the people are starving in Yemen, the people are starving everywhere. Half of the world is on diet because it's too fat, and the other world is starving. So I think that we really have to review international community from scratch. I don't think United Nations will be trustworthy anymore. I don't trust. Especially with United States now, you see how it works. It's just a kind of game between Russia, China, and see what happened in Iran. See what happened everywhere. It's scary. The world is very, very scary. And then come unthinkable, like the coronavirus. And all of a sudden, the world is collapsing. So I think that we may have a very, very strong agenda and stick to an agenda, because otherwise the subjects are so many, we have so many subjects to discuss. We have so many issues. We have to start by something. Education, of course, starvation, of course, maybe how to deal with the social network to have a better understanding of what happened. But right now, multilateralism, for me, it's totally collapsing, absolutely dead. We have no voice. I mean, France has no voice anymore. Europe is mute. United Nations, France is leading the Security Council. See what happened in Libya. See what happened in Yemen. See what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. See what happened everywhere in Syria. I mean, it's a crazy world that we are building for our children. I'm sorry, but I'm not very optimistic about the multilateralism. Really not. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I'm very ready to work with you for the best of my ability. And that's for the time being. It was my first comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathalie. Yes, I can understand that moments of pessimism pass across all of us as we look at what happened. But you're from Europe, and I will just give you another example of a remarkable group of people, both Frenchmen, as a matter of fact, whom I admire enormously, Jean Monnet and Schumann. And they were, within 10 years of the Second World War, they could envisage a Europe that would collaborate as a community of nations, not a melting pot, a community of nations. And they could foresee the collaboration of Germany and France when the others could not even imagine peace between them. And they succeeded within one generation. Young Frenchmen and young Germans cannot imagine their countries going to war with each other. That was unthinkable given 1870, 1914, 1940, etc. So things can change, and it can be done with the power of ideas. And that's what we are all here about. So let me turn to Katerina Yushchenko, who has lived with a problem of invasion and war not stopped. Katerina. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. It's such an honor and a pleasure to see everyone here. I want to just forewarn you, I am 35 kilometers outside of Kiev, so my internet occasionally goes up and down, so I apologize for that. I do believe that the Russell-Einstein Manifesto of July 55 was an important call to conscience and dialogue. But I differ with some of the previous speakers in that I think that nuclear weapons in the West served as an effective countermeasure to those in the Soviet Union and kept the Cold War from blowing up into a hot war in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s. But as we revisit this question 65 years later, and in a new geopolitical environment, I'd like to bring the perspective of Ukraine. Obviously, the mention of anything nuclear is sensitive for us, not only because we were the site of the nuclear reactor disaster in Chernobyl in '86, which had huge health, psychological, and economic effects on Ukraine that we still deal with, but also because Ukraine is unique that in 1994, we agreed to give up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. To put this in perspective, when the USSR dissolved in '91, Ukraine had 1,900 Soviet strategic nuclear warheads and between 2,500 and 4,200 Soviet tactical nuclear weapons deployed on our territory. This was more than Britain, France, and China put together. This is 6 times more than China possesses today. Indeed, Ukraine then had a nuclear capability, though not control, of course, but capability to destroy every medium to large US city 3 times over. In the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agreed to send all of its nuclear weapons to disarmament facilities in Russia. At the time, Ukraine very much asked to send them west, but they were forced to send them to Russia. Ukraine also signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In return, Russia, the US, the UK agreed to provide security assurances to Ukraine, and later France and China, as nuclear countries, signed similar assurances. The Budapest Memorandum stated that all the signatories committed to respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and its existing borders. They agreed not to use threats or force against Ukraine or economic pressure to influence its politics. The signatories agreed to seek immediate UN Security Council action to provide assistance to Ukraine if it should become the victim of an act of aggression. The agreement that Ukraine signed in 1994 saved the US and Europe trillions of dollars in defense spending over the following 2 decades. But then in 2014, one of the main signatories of the Budapest Memorandum, Russia, invaded Crimea and then Donbass, seriously undermining not only Ukraine, but Euro-Atlantic security. This was the first time since the end of World War II that a country in Europe changed borders by force. Since then, the Russian Federation has occupied 7% of Ukrainian territory, killed about 14,000 Ukrainians, and displaced about 2 million people. Yet despite the Budapest Memorandum, despite CSCE Treaty and the UN Charter, which also obliged Russia to respect Ukrainian territory, there's been minimal global reaction. I hate to say this, but the conclusion that Ukraine came to was that giving up its nuclear weapons for unenforceable assurances may have been a mistake. Furthermore, this could set a very dangerous precedent for other countries that are being pressured to give up their nuclear stockpiles, that international agreements are not worth the paper on which they're written. To answer one of the main questions in today's discussion, how to improve the effectiveness of multilateral organizations, we in Ukraine believe that it's a huge problem when you have a country like Russia that is currently involved in conflicts across the region, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Transnistria, in Georgia, Abkhazia and Ossetia, in Crimea, in Donbass, not to mention Syria and elsewhere, that Russia is able to control the agenda and have veto power in the UN Security Council. We believe it's a huge problem when the OSCE monitoring mission in Donbass includes Russian observers, when Russia is a party to a conflict, and yet some of the observers are spies linked to Russian intelligence. So, as much as I'd like to strike a note of optimism in this conversation, The experience of Ukraine shows little confidence in international agreements and in institutions that are not only extremely bureaucratic, but are often controlled by tyrannical regimes who have veto power on decisions. So we believe that the only response would be a major overhaul of the structures of these international organizations. We also think that it's very important when we talk about international dialogue, about democracy, that there's a strong response to the hybrid war, the tactics that are being used to influence international public opinion. And Ukrainians do repeat that we need to remember our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this sober and sobering assessment, Katerina. I certainly share much of your concern about what happened in Ukraine, because I believe, as you know, I've said it many times, that the Ukrainians were betrayed by that agreement with the Russian formally annexing Crimea and not respecting the boundaries that had been there. So yes, that has to be done. But we also need to say, if you don't like what you have, what can you do about it? Now, there are two choices there, and none of them are very good, but they are very challenging. Do you fix what exists, or do you scrap it and try something totally new? I suspect that there is no possibility of doing something new. Remember that the moment in 1945 was unique. The United States represented 50% of the GDP of the world, 50% total GDP of the world. American armies were everywhere, controlling from Germany to Japan. Uncontested power, the only country that had nuclear weapons and had used them in Japan. And therefore, the possibility of American leadership in getting together both the Bretton Woods organizations and the UN was very much dependent on their willingness, with this enormous edge in terms of the power that they controlled compared to the rest of the world, to create a multilateral system, their willingness to do that with an international court of justice and so on. Now they've backtracked from that. But Zlatko gave us 4 reasons why we all need multilateral collaboration in the world. The question is, do we try to fix the UN, or do we try to do something new? I believe we try to fix the UN, much as we try to fix the European Union, much as we try to fix the African Union and other such things. And so with that, let me now, if I may, turn to our friend Donato. He may wish to tell us some comment on, you're from UNITAR, anyway, you're advisor to UNITAR, so I hope that you will share your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you very much, Ismail. Thanks to everybody. I'm very pleased, first of all, that the World Academy and NGIC came together to celebrate the manifesto. I mean, the manifesto, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, it's a precursor in many ways of many successful negotiations in terms of disarmament, but beyond. Many campaigns, think about the landmine ban, chemical weapons convention. I mean, the style actually that was used at that time is still valid nowadays. So this has to give us an inspiration, I think. And when you say, Ismail, how can we fix things? How can we progress? So we are celebrating this memorable event 65 years later, but we are also restating our commitment. And this for me is even more important. The fact that we can definitely say that that manifesto, because of the intertwined elements that it contained, it was not relegated to elements of nuclear weapons or nuclear proliferation, was dealing with threats, with contemporary threats at that time. Threats that we are having nowadays, as Zlatko was saying, I agree with him on this, there are many, and they are combining one another. We can say the 4, the 5, certainly you are with us. Yeah, I would be sure. Are you waving to me, Ismail? No. I don't hear you now. What I'm saying is that reinstating this commitment, it's very important. It's very important in particular at this time when we have a sense of urgency, as Zlatko was saying. And the manifesto itself, in its own formulation, when it says, remember your humanity, it also said something that we tend to forget, that is dealing with the rest. Forget about the rest. And forget about the rest is really the most important thing when we think about giving priority, giving this sense of urgency of what are the things that we have to confront. So forget about the accumulation of personal interests. Forget about all the bureaucracies that do exist and bureaucratic processes that do exist that hamper us from succeeding in many ways. So forget about the rest is even more important than remembering about our own humanity, because we cannot forget about our humanity, but we are obviously submerged by the rest. So this is actually one of the elements, Ismail, that has to be corrected in the United Nations system, in the EU, in other international organizations, is the rest, is the pressure that is created on the organizations that make them impossible for this organization to function, is the sense of, not of independence, the sense of being obliged to follow orders by member states that impose officials as impose policies. So that obviously is a course that has to be altered if we want institutions functioning nowadays. So let me say that this is even more important nowadays because, again, as Zlatko said, we have a risk of forgetting what is important in terms of our humanity, in terms of our own heritage. Think about the danger also of canceling culture. The episodes that are happening nowadays around the world, they're not something that we can rejoice about. But the same goes with the crisis of democracy. When we see amassing of emergency powers that are really in the hands of few people and that they can exercise these powers on the excuse of COVID-19. These are serious risks. And these are the reason why, again, we have the obligation to reinstate our commitment to this unique event, to unique statement that was issued 65 years ago that can give us inspiration to alter the change, the course of events. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Gary, I'm saving you for last because I'm going to ask you to try to pull a lot of this together. But so your pearly gems of wisdom will be coming, but I'm saving you for the end. Let me now turn, if I may, to Mila. Mila, would you care to share with us some of your views on this? And then I will go to Sarai Nunes. Thank you.
I've already participated in first panel and spoke about the gross neglect and underutilization of arts and culture as strategies for peace and development. And unfortunately, what I mentioned there is that there are things that are hiding in plain sight, that the realization of SDGs 4 years past of them being adopted and ratified hinges exactly on that. But in this session, as I was listening to all the wonderful panelists, and again, I want to thank you all for showing up together here, because sometimes that's an act in and of itself. That's a show of social agency to come together and to be willing to spend time together. And I appreciate you all, and especially Rovshan for spearheading an initiative like this. As I was listening and I was thinking about, is there a way to activate social leadership without human sacrifice? I think that's going to stay, that kind of question is going to stay with me, whether that's by military intervention or whether that's by, what has happened in Tahrir Square for the Arab Spring, or with the killing of George Floyd, whose dehumanization activated social agency in the world. I'm just going to leave that question here for all of us to think about. Is there a conscious and intentional and self-motivating way in which we could generate change and move and mobilize social leadership without the human sacrifice? So, but I just want to speak for a minute about what it takes to organize for peace. And if you have ever been on the ground, in the streets with people, you would understand that it takes a lot of sophistication, organizational sophistication, to organize for peace. It is much more difficult to organize peaceful protests than to have an outpour of forces that just converge under pressure in the streets. And I want to add to Zlatko's wonderful outlining of the pressures, the forces at play, or what is at stake, that we tend to forget the fifth, if we want to list them in such a way. But there's another force rising and has always been surging up, always emerging time and again. It's the force of social leadership and the activation of social agency. And if we're looking at the institutions as they are right now and expect them to change somehow, by our thinking or by our discussions, it's not going to happen. And just like Donato pointed out, so much is at stake. There are internal formal pressures within institutions to go. In fact, there's incentivization to go by the old order of things. But that does not hold. That's not the law that runs the social agency. And what I'm calling for is the science of society that has been initiated by, say, Russell-Einstein Manifesto, when they say we need to think in a different way, which means we need to learn to think in a different way. That's what they said. You can't expect the leadership as is, institution as they are, not to first unlearn some things in order to learn new things, because they're so used to the same forms of expression, governance, or guidance, or relating, or engaging in socioeconomic relationships. And that's a long process. But what we can do is turn towards the activation of this social agency and see what are the ways in which we can connect, and which we can convene, in which we can come together. What are the ways in which we can learn from this incredible self-organizing, sophisticated self-organizing ways of youth, of civil society, that does so on a daily basis, because these are existential things that they are attending to, and immediate things in their local communities and regions. What are the ways in which we can learn from them? And what are the ways in which we can connect highest international institutions with that knowledge, with that vibrancy of energy and knowledge? So I'm wondering about ways in which we can correlate individual, communal, national, international learning. I'm wondering about expanding context for that learning. And that context, we continually squeeze between set of positions and a round table in a Security Council, and they're valid, and that's what the power to be is. But there's also these other powers and these other forces at play that we need to pay attention to and encourage to grow. So the ever-expanding context in which we're speaking of multilateralism, of human security, is actually going from in a set of concentric circle. It's going from the national to international to global level to now planetary sense of belonging and sense of being and becoming as well. And if we want to think about multilateralism within the planetary context, then we're going to have a different discussion. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. And for that, I can say that in the midst of the suffering and human sacrifice and vulnerability, we have grown under the pressure of the spirit of the times, as Jung would say. We have grown weary, anxious, exhausted, right? Disheartened. And if there's anything about this manifesto, is that you have human beings, disillusioned scientists, for sure, but enheartened human beings that are calling us to action. And the fact that it has been 65 years ago, we could say, for goodness sake, we've lost so much time. Or we can realize that this kind of resolute, this kind of courageous conviction, courage of conviction, is something that is shown in daily recommitment. On a daily basis, we need to recommit to them on a personal level, national level, community level, international level. I mean, that's what we're called for to do. That's why the resonance and the relevance of this manifesto. To be able to do that in a world that has weaponized us, that has instrumentalized us as members of associations, institutions. Let's be real here about our own complicities with everything. In the world that inundates us with the spectacles of distraction or wars or violently pornographic culture, the capacity to sensitize people is crucial. In the world of AI, in the world of military, in the world of money, media, and all of that, it is crucial to be able to aesthetically enculture people, because the opposite of aesthetic is anesthetic. And for that, we desperately need enculturing leaders all over again. And these are some of my thoughts with which I wanted to kind of share our humanity and resolutely speak about the manifesto as a call to us time and again.
Thank you, Mila, for this, I consider, optimistic and encouraging statement, a call to action indeed, much as Russell and Einstein and company, when they wrote that manifesto, clearly also were clear-eyed about the obstacles in front of them and the disenchantment, but they felt that the call to action was needed, and we did follow that through.
If you don't mind, Ismail, I'll just say one more thing. We are witnessing an empathetic revolution in the whole world right now, and we're being blind to it. People are rising in the streets anywhere in Tehran.
We're not blind to it at all. We're not blind to it at all. No, it's everywhere. It started in the United States, but it has certainly spread all the way to Australia and through London and Paris and everywhere else. No, but that reminds me of my youth in '68. Young people stood up in France, stood up in London, in New York, in Cairo, everywhere. So these things, we still say, the spirit of '68 is still strong with a lot of people. Let me just now turn to Sarai Nunez. Yes, thank you. You have, please, 2 minutes, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to extend heartfelt greetings from Ms. Gabriela Cuevas, President of the Interparliamentary Union. I would also like to thank the Nizami Ganjavi International Center and the World Academy of Arts and Sciences and its President, Gary Jacobs, for this honorable invitation. Commemorating the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, it is important to say that humanity's most complicated problems long ago went beyond the local sphere. From organized crime that operates as a transnational organization, just like the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, my country, that operates in more than 80 countries, to environmental sustainability and development problems, they all require global response. One of the ways to educate public opinion is to confront them with the local consequences of world problems. And this, of course, has to do with disarmament. How climate change can affect a tourist community in Southeast Asia, and at the same time leave a small city in northern Guatemala without water. How can dust from the Sahara can reach North America and cause health damage, or ash from a volcano in Northern Europe can cause respiratory diseases in South America? The coronavirus evidenced the fragility of the world and the need to broaden up our gaze beyond ideologies. Global health, security, food, the world economic system, energy, air, and water quality are all problems that we all have to face together. What happens when a country badly responds to a pandemic and puts other countries at risk? Esther Duflo won the Nobel Prize in Economics last year for her contribution to the fight against poverty. Her contribution is great for being simple and consists of dividing a problem as complex as poverty into smaller, manageable, and easy to solve problems. For example, poverty in a country is overwhelming, but to solve it, to take a city and work for it to have water, schools, a hospital, therefore becomes a manageable problem. In the IPU, parliamentarians from all over the world are able to turn the great problems of humanity into manageable agendas that can be touched in each national context. We need to integrate this effort into a shared vision. The grounds of the Einstein-Russell Manifesto are still effective. It does not depend so much on the ever-present threat of human self-destruction, but rather on the need to act as human beings, members of the species man, I quote, and women, whose continued existence is in doubt. The world is full of conflicts that must be addressed. I today speak on behalf of the Interparliamentary Union, an organization which aim is to empower 179 member parliaments to promote peace, and I would like to finish stressing our commitment to act collectively, address global challenges, and contribute to a global alliance for action against threats to global human security and well-being, and of course, the eradication of nuclear threats. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech. I now have on my list here a number of people, including Rovshan. You want to say something, Rovshan? Go ahead.
Actually, thank you, Dr. Ismail. We had actually the previous panel, but in the previous panel, I also we've been discussing about how effective, because with the death of George Floyd, there was a social movement that no one could ever expect. I mean, sometimes we could think that, what's happening in the United States of America in that kind of sense, it's not going to be affecting Britain or France or Italy and the rest of the world, but it's been like a wave which is running to all over the world. And that was bringing also a question that how United Nations will be in condition to respond to the change. Are we going to expect the United Nations to change the Security Council system, which is unlikely. We don't believe that it's going to be happening. But also the most important thing is about multilateralism. When we are talking multilateralism, but the major sponsor of multilateralism is the United States of America. And now US is withdrawing from every single agreement, and we are not sure that what's going to happen in November. The rest, two more important issues that is coming, we previously been talking about the weapons, about the wars, but I think that now we have to talk about another wars. It's a digital war, because the social media is playing and going to play a more important role, is becoming a more powerful weapons than troops, military troops like tanks or bombs and so on. You can, using Facebook or Twitter, you can mobilize dozens, millions of people to go to streets and to do whatever they want to do, to raise their voices. That's also important. And the another thing that what Ms. Katerina also was saying, in our part of the world also, how we have UN Security Council. Even sometimes they can accept something, but is there any proof that they trust that they are going to fulfill their commitments? Like what happened with the Ukraine cases, when Ukraine gave it's the only country which gave all its weapons, nuclear weapons. And then with Nagorno-Karabakh, or what's happening now in Georgia, and what's happening in Syria, Libya, Yemen is almost facing the humanitarian disaster. It's the biggest humanitarian disaster in the world, plus with the COVID. And that's all the things bringing up how it's going to affect the multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravshan, for these observations. Let me now turn to Jonathan Granoff, who is the president of the Global Security Institute. And we've been of course, talking about some of the cases where global security has not reached from Yemen to Syria to Nagorno-Karabakh to Ossetia and so on. So please give us your views, hopefully 5 minutes, but a few seconds more will be welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, first, Joseph Rotblat was one of the signers of the manifesto. Joseph Rotblat really exemplified the conduct that Mila was highlighting, the sense of individual accountability. That if you look at all of these issues from a purely global perspective, then you're taking on a responsibility that's beyond what any individual can actually have or do. What he did was he responded to another dimension of our humanity that makes us human, which is called conscience. And as an act of conscience, he walked off the Manhattan Project. It was clear to him that the logic of the bomb, which was to deter the Nazis, was no longer existing once the heavy water facility in Norway was destroyed. And he went to the leaders of the Manhattan Project and said, the logic is no longer here, and we should stop. And they disagreed with him because so much money had been invested in the project. But he, as a human being, as one man, stood up and said, enough is enough, I'm leaving, it's wrong. That's what Socrates did. He drank the hemlock despite being wrongfully accused. And because of that act of that individual, the supremacy in social organization of the rule of law over arbitrary use of power is a principle we all hold dear. And the examples of individuals standing up go long and powerful throughout history. And that's what the call to remember your humanity is. It's a call to individuals. Now, the statement is a civilization level statement. And remember, the group of people who wrote it were scientists. And they were essentially saying that the scientific methodology alone is insufficient to lead us into a future. And that's why they call upon our humanity. Now, why is science insufficient? Well, science is a tool of investigation that sets the basis for technological capacity, but it doesn't give us the capacity of pursuing the good. And so we're actually the first we are a global civilization in which the pursuit of the good and the pursuit of the real have become disconnected. And the pursuit of the real, solely relying on scientific methodology, led this group of scientists within this group, and one philosopher, a philosopher of science too, Russell, to come back to the very foundation of what makes us unique, which is human. Now, one of the capacities that humans have is the ability of myth making. And I would say that the problem we're facing today, if we're to address the relevance of this statement today, is that we are pursuing security based on a series of myths. The most prominent one with respect to nuclear weapons is the justification for the nuclear weapons. And there are two justifications that the enterprise that supports them put forward. One is strategic stability. And strategic stability is obviously immeasurable. It's an abstraction. The other is the one that we heard from Professor Luttwak, which I think boils down to the pursuit of military advantage and domination, such that no countries would challenge it. So countries with nuclear weapons, particularly the two that have 96% of the weapons, are pursuing military advantage. Clearly a myth at odds with strategic stability. And military advantage has not proved to be all that significant in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and certainly in a world with asymmetric threats of cyber and the real danger of weaponization of biology. So there are myths that we are using, the myth of the state as the basis of sovereignty rather than the foundation of the state with the human conscience individual. The other reality that we have is the tool of science. The tool of science is a very good tool to address protecting the climate, protecting the oceans, protecting the rainforests, protecting the water table, addressing pandemic diseases. It's a tool, but the tool now has to be based on our humanity rather than the pursuit of power. And that myth of the pursuit of power is at the heart of this entire matter. So I just want to put forward some very real things that we could achieve presently. There's 115 countries in nuclear weapons-free zones. They should speak as one voice. They need to be organized. 2, there's no logic whatsoever in maintaining a first use of nuclear weapons policy. It's an indefensible position because the general public thinks that the reason for nuclear weapons is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. But that's not actually the policies of the states with nuclear weapons. There must be real pressure on the leaders of countries as individuals, to step forward and begin acting as adults and start negotiating the elimination of the weapons which they are legally required to do under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the unanimous ruling of the International Court of Justice. But, you know, during the height of the Cold War, the Six Nation Initiative of Tanzania, Nuriye, Rajiv Gandhi from India, Papandreou from Greece, Olof Palme from Sweden, went to, and 2 others went to Moscow and Washington and said to Gorbachev and Reagan, it's our world too. We're human beings and we demand that you start talking to each other. It's that kind of initiative that middle power and small countries can take now. But at the general debates, we're not hearing any courage from these countries, even countries that are supporting the Prohibition Treaty. We're not hearing heads of state say, as our humanity, step up, live up to what is necessary. At this moment, we're in a critical moment of choice. Are we going to continue to pursue security through myths, or are we going to use the tools of science and our humanity? Because if we're going to have human security, we have to bring our human quality in. And I want to end, obviously I could rant on for a while, and I apologize for my extreme passion about this, but I am always reminded of the eyes of a child and a mother. I was in India, and the mother wanted to give me her infant because she didn't believe she could take care of it. And I thought of that child, and I thought of the theft of the food for that child being squandered on weaponry that wouldn't help that child or help anybody. And I'm informed by the eyes of that child. That remembrance awakens my humanity. But I want to end highlighting that this event is co-sponsored by the Nizami Ganjavi International Center. And I want to thank them for that in the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. But I want to remind everybody of a quote from the great Sufi wise man Nizami, who said, "Love grants me powers nature would deny." Isn't that the same as remember your humanity, forget the rest? And so so we have two statements that guide us. One, our core humanity, which binds us together, and love that transcends and brings us up. So I say, let's remember all the dimensions of our humanity. Science, overcoming myth, love, overcoming limitation, and our humanity that brings us together. These are things that it's our responsibility to go behind and let those principles guide our policies.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very inspiring statement and, as you say, passionate statement. I now have 2 people who have not spoken at all, and one is Sharon, Sweden, and one is Peter Metz. Sharon? Briefly, please, because we're running out of time. Please, Sharon, go ahead.
Dear sir, I will be very brief. I'm just here as an observer. I have nothing just to say, more than thank you.
Mr. Metz, are you here also as an observer?
We have only Gary.
Hmm?
Gary left.
No, we still have. I have two promises which I cannot forget. The gender balance with Maria Spinoza. We're gonna come back. You know me. I'm a feminist all my life. Ravshan, you think I'm gonna bypass that?
No,
and
no.
I specifically even hinted to Maria that we should come back to 1325.
No,
Maria, you have the floor.
Natalie and Katerina.
Yeah. Well, we'll hear from the ladies now, but let's first. I promised Maria at the beginning. Go ahead, Maria. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ismail. It's been so inspiring that I think this is my last opportunity, and so I wanted to make some general comments, but without saying that equality, I think, should be a key word for peace. I think that we have now, overwhelming evidence that gender equality and women's empowerment are closely linked to stability and peacefulness. I think that gender equality, and we have seen it over and over again, is a strong predictor of a state's peacefulness than its level of democracy, gross domestic product, etc. I think we have proved that where women are more empowered, the state is less likely to experience civil conflict or go to war with its neighbors. And I think basically the shorthand is we need more women in sustaining peace, in peace building and peacekeeping. We need more women participating in peace processes because then the outcomes last longer. And here is not that I am speaking science fiction, but there is tons of evidence that this is the reality. And I think that we have one of our responsibilities, collective and individual, is to close this huge gender gap. The specialists speak about if the trends continue in terms of women's political participation, involvement in peace processes, in disarmament efforts, the global gender gap would close only in 100 years or more. And I think we cannot wait that long. And I would just invite you all to look at the Global Peace Index, which is, staggering, but also shows how important the participation of women is. This year, we commemorate the 20 years of Resolution 1325. And as a former Minister of Defense, I can tell you that, to invest in women and to see women not only as victims of conflict, but as agents of peace building and peacekeeping, I think really pays off. I won't go into more details, but I would just like to close perhaps with a couple of sentences only. The number one is that the UN is irreplaceable. I know that it is not perfect because it's human-made, but I am a strong believer in multilateral responses to global problems. And I think that perhaps we have now the opportunity, we are living a moment of building a new era in our multilateral system. And just to remind ourselves that the multilateral system is not self-regulated. It is not an autonomous weapon. It is made by societies, by leaders. The multilateral system is what we want it to be. And sometimes we think that it is out there, and people tend to blame the UN for everything. It stops short on this, it's not doing this well, etc., etc. But it is in our hands. There are several processes that are happening right now. The UN 75 commemoration, which has fostered a global dialogue around the world to bring the UN closer to the people and strengthen the agency of society. And I think that we do have a collective responsibility. We do have, the responsibility of co-creating, co-crafting this new moment in the multilateral system. So I am a stubborn optimist, and I think we need to continue to put our collective effort, our intelligence, our wisdom together for this moment of reinvention, of strengthening, reboosting the multilateral system. It is the only way. There is no plan B. Our plan is to strengthen the system we have with all its shortcomings. But when you just think that the UN feeds more than 80 million people every day, that the UN is now delivering humanitarian aid to respond to the COVID crisis. It is doing its share. It is, of course, not perfect. And just to end by quoting a Nobel laureate that I really, really love, a writer, Elie Wiesel, when he said that the opposite of love is not hate, but it is indifference. And I think we need to fight indifference with creativity, with our intellect, with our wisdom, with our commitment. So I still have to say that I am a strong, stubborn optimist, and there is a lot to do to fight this, what I call implementation deficit that we're living, but it's up to us. It is
Thank
also
you.
in our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear from Natalie and Katrina, but very, very brief, because we're running out of time, but we can't stop on the gender issue with only one speaker. I will also speak on behalf of the gender issues, but if you have something to say, I saw you going like that, so Natalie, go ahead. Yes.
I've nothing to add, especially after Elie Wiesel. There is no point.
Yes.
I mean,
it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a piece of humanity. Just if with the center, we can build a kind of roadmap, because states are not the only actor in international community. You have the foundation, you have NGO, you have a lot of Bill Gates Foundation with more assets than a lot of countries in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
So as my practical intelligence is done like that, I need concrete actions. So think tank is not enough for me. I need to think and act.
Good.
So very ready. I'm a lawmaker, so very ready to help and contribute to your work and your action. And thank you for having me today.
Très bien, je viendrai vous voir à Paris. I'll come and see you there. Katrina.
Well, I couldn't agree with Maria Fernanda more about the role of women, and just would like to add that when Ukraine was invaded, the first people who acted were the women, creating NGOs to support the war movement, the displaced people, women trying to enter government and trying to place more of a policy role. Unfortunately, we have a society that doesn't always accept that, but it's changing little bit by little. I also want to add that when I criticize the UN, it didn't mean that I think it needs to be scrapped. It does need to be reformed. And so I'm so glad that there are people who are thinking about these issues and are going to make it more responsive to the needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Peter Metz asked for a very brief, I emphasize, intervention before I go to Gary. Peter, go ahead.
Thank you, Ismail. You blocked my video, so nobody can see my face, except this frozen image that I presented some time ago. I'm here at the invitation of Jonathan Granoff. Last year I had and I will be very brief, I had the good fortune to participate in the 17th annual summit of the Nobel Peace Laureates. At that summit and the nuclear disarmament session, Willem de Klerk made what I consider to be the most compelling statement. He slammed his hand on the table and said, "We must arouse the people." And I think he's absolutely right. So then the question is, how do you do that? Well, there are two ways. One is with a galvanizing incident, like a nuclear detonation we don't want, and let's pray that it's not the one that's possible, which is inadvertent launching of missiles by both sides under the mutually assured destruction mechanism, or by some kind of worldwide campaign. But we must arouse the people, because if we don't arouse the people, then all of these decision makers are not going to feel ennobled to take the bold step to negotiate mutual nuclear disarmament. I have lots more to say about that, but let's focus on arousing the people.
Thank you very much. Now let me turn to my good friend Gary. Gary Jacobs, you have the floor. And for you, it won't be 5 minutes, it'll be 6 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you.
First, thank you, Ismail. Thank you, Roshan, NGIC, for partnering with us on this event. And thanks all of you, the panelists, for joining us here. It's been a very rich, heartfelt discussion, frank discussion, which raised a lot of anxieties and a lot of problems that we know we have to look square in the eye. It's also come back, bounced back with, I think, some very meaningful focus for this. I think at least half of you have been directly involved with the World Academy's project with the United Nations in Geneva, and so I won't spend time reiterating about it. But I'd like to just kind of put this discussion in the perspective I see it, and I think it will resonate with what you've all been saying. We are at extraordinary times in history. It's not easy to find a time where the speed and magnitude of change and uncertainty and turbulence has reached this level in the past, except for World War, where our loss of faith and confidence in the institutions that we look to proverbially, perennially for answers and solutions, national governments, international institutions, the media, even the scientific community is up for heavy criticism today. Our educational system, everything's being questioned. There's an ambiguity, there's an uncertainty, there's a sense of fragility. But when we had our meeting in June 15th to 19th with about 200 participants, panelists, 35 panels for people from all over the world, 40% women. We didn't quite get to the 50%, but we're aiming for 60% next time. About 370 live participants on there, and then many, many more offline. Something really struck me, and not only me, because I talked to many people afterwards. The sense of urgency, no doubt, we all felt. But what I didn't expect was so much the sense of opportunity. We did a meeting with the UN in 2013 to talk about global social challenges, to put them out on the table so we can look at them face on and recognize the problems we have. And they seem to be a lot easier then than they do today. And therefore, I was expecting all the pessimism and all the reasonable, rational anxiety and opposition that we could get to doing anything. And yet, that's not what I found in the people, hundreds of people I talked to at the conference. There was a sense that somehow things are different now. And somehow the very urgency, the very deep roots that it's shaking up make something possible. I can very much identify, with the number of you, I think Zlatko was the first to mention it, but it was that the answer, we not only need multilateralism, but we need to redefine multilateralism in many ways. And one of the fundamental ways we have to redefine it is to think it's not all about national governments by elected political figures who have to be elected by their own constituencies that are going to be the future of the multilateral system. Many of you, I couldn't keep track to how many, said, we've got to go to the people. Ismail went back to 1968. while you were saying that, I was going back to 1964 when I was a freshman at UC Berkeley and the free speech movement broke out. Right at the time when the Vietnam War was heating up, when the civil rights movement was in a crisis, when we thought we had a lot of problems then, nothing to compare with now. The environmental movement wasn't born by government and government leaders. It was born by the demands, the aspirations of the public who were waking up, a prosperous baby boomer generation that wanted something better and didn't like the direction that things are going in. And I'm not a prophet, but I feel if ever we've had an opportunity since 1945 to make a big change, this is the time, and we need the pressure and we need the sense of urgency that Zlatko was talking about to do something of this, to break the inertia. And when you think back to 1945, when the UN system was created, it's unbelievable because none of the signatories were planning on a dissolution of colonial empires. Who wants to deal with hundreds of nation states? It's too complicated. 55 is enough. Big empires make it possible for us to manage the world. And yet in 15 years, the colonial system had completely dissolved. It wasn't predicted, but it happened. In 1989, July, Gorbachev and Chancellor Kohl met, and they were talking about the future of Europe. And in the privacy of a conversation with just interpreters there, they agreed that the reunification of Germany was inevitable. And they also agreed that because of the resistance of the forces that were in place, that were so real, that it's going to take maybe 30 to 50 years or more. And this is the fact of their conversation, 30 to 50 years. Within 12 months, not only the Berlin Wall had fallen, that only took 4 months, Germany was de facto reunified, and you know what else happened at that time. It doesn't mean we solved all our problems, or we wouldn't be here today if we did. But I think the question is, how do we build the momentum? And that's what was recently mentioned. How do we unleash the social awakening that's there, the social energies there? How do we mobilize them to generate more pressure, not just at the national level, at the global level? And that's what we're looking for in this project, which we call GL21, or Global Leadership in the 20s. We're looking for catalytic strategies that can release the energy, the aspirations, the values, and commitment of people all over the world, because there is an awakening. Opinion polls show 3/4 of the world's population wants to get rid of these weapons. And a lot of that's in countries that have them too, in the US and others as well. So I think I'm grateful for all of the ideas we've heard and for all the energy and offers of collaboration. What we're trying to do in the next 4 months is do exactly what we've been talking about here. How do we operationalize good intentions or high ideals? How do we really take it forward? What are the steps we can take? And there are steps we can take. The kind of collaboration we're having, the Academy's having with partner organizations like NGOs, NGIC, and many others, is an example of we're no longer working in our cubicles. We're no longer working to define ourselves. We're crossing not only organizations, but we're crossing sectors. We're going to look at the whole picture. How do we release that energy? How do we create that awareness? You know, today, and I'm just going to end with one idea.
Please.
Heard.
Go ahead.
Today, global society has no way to weigh in on issues. We hear about the issues from nation states. We hear about the issues through the media and through civil society organizations with the small scope they get in the multilateral organizations. But we believe it's possible now to create a system where we can directly hear from the people at the global level on issues and build a much greater sense of commonality, shared awareness, shared values, will further multiply the energy that's there. It's one of many ideas we've heard, have been proposed, and in the next 4 months, we're working to build on them and we invite you, request you, come forward with the best crazy ideas or whatever it is that you have to offer, because we want to, when we come out of the final meeting, just one more sentence, Ismail, when we come out of the final meeting in October, which is supposed to be at the UN in Geneva, 27th and 20th, if it's not there, it'll be in cyberspace. We want to communicate one thing, absolutely without question. There is so much we can do. We are not paralyzed, not helpless. We don't have to wait for the leaders who are not acting. There are things we can do. We can do it in education and every other area. And then we'll move ahead and see how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I have additional requests from David and from Zlatko, but I will give you 30 seconds each. I'm sorry, we are really out of time, and I myself have to chair another meeting at the 12th, so I have another few minutes only left. So David, please go right ahead, and then Zlatko, and then I'll wrap up. So please go ahead, David.
I will be brief. I said I had 7 things that were driving me right now. We're working very hard with young Indigenous youth in Canada. And one of the ways we're arousing the youth is gathering the Indigenous youth to talk about their future. They got a million problems right now, but we don't talk about them. We ask questions like, what if your school was better? What if you didn't have to boil water? So that's one thing. Secondly, my message is going to finish with what has been said by others, and that addresses the fact that remember your humanity, but in these times, decades later, we cannot forget the rest, because the rest is interconnected and must drive how we react to the nuclear issue, the climate issue, the crime issue, whatever. We have to look at this as a system of systems. That's a foresight issue. Thank you.
Zlatko?
Yeah. First point, democracy is not perfect. Someone said, Churchill probably, but nothing better is invented, so we have to keep improving democracy. Same thing applies to United Nations. United Nations and current multilateral organizations are not perfect, but nothing else was invented better so far. So we have to do a lot of pressure to reunite it. When I say a lot of pressure, I think alliance of like-minded people that are promoting dialogue, tolerance, learning and understanding, Nizami Ganjavi, right? Those 4 words. And I'm so glad that Gary mentioned a few times education, because that's the second line. First line is we have to put the pressure on current people. The second line is we have to rejuvenate, re-engineer, and remobilize educational system that will be education for character, not only for knowledge and technology. So, bon voyage on those 2 paths.
Thank you very much, Zlatko. Dear friends, I mean, Gary did a lot of the summation, and we still have a lot of work to do. I want to just leave you with an optimistic note, and I'm always an optimist. And the optimistic note is based on 2 things. I listened to Martin Luther King when he said, I have a dream, and I will not be with you for the promised land. But he had a dream, and I lived to see it when Barack Obama got elected. The idea that a black man would get elected with white votes in America seemed almost impossible. Now, there was a backlash to that, and we see right now the white supremacists coming back again. But that was an enormous movement. And if I spoke specifically, I mean, I lived the 60s in the United States, but if I spoke specifically of 68, it was for 2 things. This was a terrible year. Robert Kennedy got assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. We had major confrontations at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. But at the same time, we had just passed the civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act. We were fighting for women's liberation, as it was called at the time, for the free speech movement. There was an anti-war movement, anti-apartheid. There was an enormous idealism going on. And in 68, it struck out from the United States to Paris, to London, to everywhere else. And that was a reminder that people can move. Today, we watched after the George Floyd reactions in the United States, Black Lives Matter, but beyond that, it was really for the protection of minorities. And it had an echo in London, in Paris, all the way to Australia. This younger generation is now picking up again, and it's picking up with the progressive values that we all hope will one day find their manifestation in the kinds of global problems we're dealing with, from climate change to war to the injustice of dealing with minorities practically everywhere in the world. Greta Thunberg is a bright example of how young people can actually get involved. And in so doing, they may change the politics of the world. So let me say thank you very much to each and everyone. Those who have additional things to say, please send them by email to us at the Nizami Center. And I thank you each and everyone, and I declare this session now completed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.